Those were happier days, when there was still close friendship at times between folk of different race, even between dwarves and elves. It was not the fault of the dwarves that the friendship waned, said Gimli. I have not heard that it was the fault of the elves, said Legolas. I have heard both, said Gandalf, and I will not give judgment now. But I beg you two, Legolas and Gimli, at least to be friends, and to help me. I need you both. Michael Vonnen and hail, my friends. Yoistin here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be discussing the great schism between elves and dwarves, and why they generally dislike one another in Tolkien's works. I'll also go ahead and link my video about why Galadriel gave Gimli 3 of her hairs, and other videos that relate to this one in the description below and cards above. Now, let's begin our tale. Starting with the beginning of both kindreds, the elves were the firstborn children of Ilúvatar. As we know, they had a love for nature, things and creations of natural beauty, and starlight. Now when the dwarves were created by Aule the Smith and adopted by Ilúvatar, as they were given autonomy and Fëar, or spirits, they loved stone, the working of metal, things of a different kind of beauty, and industry. Both races had a love of gems, however, and that will come into play here pretty soon. Already though, from the beginning of these kindreds in the Years of the Trees, there were fundamental differences between them. Yavanna, who was the wife of Aule, even petitioned Ilúvatar through Manwë for the creation of the Ents, as he'd given mercy to Aule and his dwarves. The Ents would serve to protect the forests from dwarves, orcs, and other creatures who may see the trees harmed. Now the elves loved the Ents and vice versa, as the elves awoke the Ents and taught them speech, but Ents were not particularly fond of dwarves or their axes, and they even fought the dwarves during the aftermath of the Battle of the Thousand Caves, which we shall discuss later. But my point is that even in their innate natures, there were fundamental differences between the elves and the dwarves since the beginning of time. Among the dwarves were petty dwarves, who were shorter in stature, more unsociable than other dwarves, and gave away their Khazad-dûl names freely instead of keeping them secret. These dwarves were outcasts from the 7 houses of the dwarves, and when they first came into Beleriand during the First Age, the Sindar elves did not know what they were, taking them for beasts, so they hunted the petty dwarves. The elves would not know their mistake until they encountered the common dwarves who came from the east over the Blue Mountains into Beleriand. But the petty dwarves would never forget being hunted, and this small group of dwarves would always hate the Sindar and later the Noldor more so, for the Noldor would later take some of the land of the petty dwarves. Nargothrond itself was built in one of the homes of the petty dwarves. The common dwarves that came from the east and became friends with the elves were the Broadbeams and the Firebeards, but not the Longbeards as far as I can tell, which will be important later. The Broadbeams and Firebeards, who awoke in the Blue Mountains, built Nogrod and Belegost, which would be great dwarven kingdoms until their destruction in the War of Wrath. The Sindar called these dwarves the Naugrim, the Stunted People, and since this was during the Second Age of Melkor's imprisonment in Valinor, within the Years of the Trees, there was little darkness and evil in Middle-earth. And there was great friendship between the kindreds during certain peaceful times throughout all of the history of Middle-earth. When Eregion and Khazad-dûm, Lothlorien and Khazad-dûm, and Mirkwood and Erebor were at their heights of power and progress, there were great alliances between elves and dwarves, but succeeding events would ruin such times. It's interesting that during times of peace there is friendship between the two kindreds, but usually when a disaster happens, such as the unearthing of the Balrog in 1980 of the Third Age and the coming of Smaug in 2770 of the Third Age, they usually become more distant or adversarial towards one another before joining together in the fight against the darkness, such as in the Battle of the Five Armies or the War of the Ring. It also seems that the elves blame the dwarves for unearthing the Balrog, as Celeborn does in the Fellowship of the Ring, which can't help matters between the two kindreds. So getting back to the elves and the Naugrim during the Elder Days, the two kindreds worked together closely throughout the Years of the Trees, and even well into the First Age, building places such as Menegroth and Nargothrond together. The Dark Elf Eul and his son Maeglin would go to Nogrod in peace and honor many times throughout the First Age as well. The dwarves would even come to trade, work alongside, and be allies with the Noldor, quote, "Yet in the tempering of steel alone of all crafts, the dwarves were never outmatched even by the Noldor, and in the making of mail of linked rings which was first contrived by the smiths of Belegost, their work had no rival." End quote. Again, for a long time the alliance between elves and dwarves was strong, and they even fought together in the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. However, the time would come when this would not be so. After the quest for the Silmaril, Thingol would come into possession of one of the Silmarils, and he would desire to have it be put into the necklace Naglamir, which had been made by the dwarves and recovered out of Nargothrond by Hurin, the father of Turin, which he would give to Thingol. So Thingol would commission the Dwarves of Nogrod to put the Silmaril within the Noglamir, which already had gems from Valinor in it, thus crafting the single greatest artifact of the union of elves and dwarves in the history of Middle-earth. After they did so, the dwarves would demand the necklace for payment, which had been originally made by the dwarves of Ered Luin for Finrod Felagund. But Thingol saw that they truly desired the Silmaril, so he would try to send them off without payment. And in turn, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains slew Ilu Thingol, king of Doriath, and they took the Noglamir for themselves. It would be recovered by Thingol's elves, and all of those dwarves except for 2 of them would be hunted down and killed by the elves of Doriath. The 2 survivors would go back to their kin and rally their anger, telling them that the Elven King ordered the dwarves to be slain, and thus the dwarves were cheated out of their reward. The dwarves of Nogrod would ask for aid from the dwarves of Belegost, which would be denied, even as those of Belegost wished to dissuade the dwarves of Nogrod from their purpose. But the dwarves went forth anyway, coming into Doriath and Menegroth and doing the Battle of the Thousand Caves. After many elves were slain in the first sack of Doriath and the treasures of Menegroth, including the Noglamir, were taken, the dwarves went back east and encountered the army of Beren, his son Dior, a host of green elves, and Ents also, who saw to the destruction of the dwarves and the reclamation of the Noglamir, which would be an heirloom of Luthien, the daughter of Thingol. Ultimately, this event was the greatest cause of dislike and hatred between the elves and the dwarves. However, I return to the point that these dwarves of Nogrod and even those of Belegost who did not take part in the battle were not Longbeards, Durin's folk, who yet lived in Khazad-dûm and the Iron Hills during the First Age. After the destruction of Nogrod and Belegost at the end of the First Age and beginning of the Second Age, many of the remaining Broadbeams and Firebeards would go and mix with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Now I bring this up because during the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, there is great tension between the elves of Mirkwood and the dwarves of Erebor, but I think this hatred was somewhat misguided, for the ancestors of most of the dwarves of Thorin's company were not responsible for the death of Thingol and his kin, who were Sindarin elves like King Thranduil and his family. It's possible that Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur were the descendants of Broadbeams and or Firebeards, but that would still not be enough cause for Thranduil to dislike the dwarves of Thorin's company, nor would he know that their ancestors may have been the ones to kill Thingol. But perhaps the dwarven clans joining together is part of the reason the elves distrust and dislike the Longbeards. But the rest of the dwarves in Thorin's company and Gimli himself are of Durin's line, the Longbeards. But it's possible that in the eyes of the elves, they saw all dwarves as the same. Continuing forward, even the necklace of Girion in The Hobbit bears similarities to the Noglamir. The necklace was returned to Girion's heir Bard from the dwarves, and the gems were taken out of the necklace to give to Thranduil, meaning that all 3 races had dealt with the necklace at one point or another, just like the Noglamir. But this necklace was handled with wisdom and tact that did not come into play with the Noglamir. Overall, I would say that the killing of Thingol and the Battle of the Thousand Caves, as well as some of the events in The Hobbit such as Thranduil imprisoning the dwarves of Thorin's company and marching to Erebor for a share of the mountain's treasure, were the causes of distrust and dislike between the elves and the dwarves. But as we all know with Gimli and Legolas during and after the War of the Ring, the 2 best friends would repair much of what was lost in ages past between the 2 folk, and the gift of Galadriel's hairs to Gimli would be encased in crystal as a, quote, pledge of goodwill between the mountain and the wood until the end of days. End quote. This friendship would go on even into Valinor, when Gimli became the only dwarf to go to the Undying Lands, in 120 of the Fourth Age. This brings us to the end of our tale. From the tension and dislike between the elves and dwarves, we see the sorrow and loss that may come from simple greed and selfishness, but from the friendship of Legolas and Gimli we see that camaraderie, trust, and love may repair what was lost and set a new age of peace. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode of Middle-earth Explained. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this video with a friend. Let me know your thoughts about the relationship between the elves and dwarves in the comments below. I think it is a great element of Tolkien's works, for these 2 kindreds are polar opposites, but even they can overcome their differences to face a larger threat. Furthermore, let me know any questions, additions, and corrections you have in the comments below. Also, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, and our merch in the description below. For our Westernest podcast, Discord server, and other perks, check out our Patreon and please consider donating for just $1 a month. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I will see you all again next week with a new video. Right now I'm in talks with some people about a video that I know you all will like, but I'm not quite sure when I will have that video ready for release, as it's still under embargo, so that will either be next week or the week after. If it doesn't happen next week, I will see you all with a different video. Either way, I will see you all again next week. As always, everyone, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.